passed, but let's at least start with my introduction. So I'm really happy to welcome Joanie Willett. I mean, Joanie's been with ESI for a long time now, but Joanie's in politics, working on complex relationships between people, communities, and their surrounding landscape, and thinking about how the tangled relationships between all of them can have implications for our politics and our social and environmental justice. Joanie obtained an MA in Critical Global Studies, then a PhD at the University of Exeter with a PhD thesis entitled Why is Cornwall So Poor? Narrative, Perception, and Identity. During her PhD, she also taught on a social work degree with the University of Plymouth, and then very soon after completing her PhD, she got an academic position in the politics department here, and she's also become the co-director and co-founding director. Co-director.
Not founding.
Okay, of the Institute of Cornish Studies, which brings together academic research in and about Cornwall. And the title of the talk is Politics More Than Human? How American local government is created by the environment. Thank you, Joanie.
Thank you so much, Camille, and also thanks Rita for all of the work that you've been doing, putting this this seminar, but also like the whole series together. I really appreciate it. This work is it's a slight little bit of a crossover. So it arose out of a Fulbright scholarship that I was doing this time last year. I was in the US, and it was lots and lots of fun. I was sort of based in Appalachia, which is kind of like on the eastern side of the United States, and but ended up doing kind of like quite a lot of traveling around. And one of the places I ended up traveling to was a community called Grass Valley in California. And I went there because, you know, like any good Cornish woman, when you find yourself somewhere else over St. Piran's Day, you want to go somewhere where they also celebrate it. So they do in Grass Valley. So I went there, and there were just all kinds of really interesting questions. I was only there about a week, but it just set off all kinds of really, really interesting questions, which ended up in this talk. So I'm asking the question about whether politics, or is politics more than human? I'm also really aware that for the geographers amongst us, and also people who are of a more anthropological background, etc., this is a little bit like Geography and Anthropology 101. However, in politics, we're very, very late to this party. Also, a few people have written much more recently about the tangled relationship between politics and the ecologies, geologies, and geographies that we come from. But they don't tend to be from politics backgrounds. They tend to be from other backgrounds, which is quite interesting in and of itself. So from a politics perspective, we've got lots of learning to do from a lot of other disciplines, and lots of interesting questions to be exploring. So that's what we're getting started on today. So the starting point for my talk is to what extent does the environment shape our politics, and, you know, as much as our politics shapes our environment. So or environments, I should say. So from a very political kind of perspective, we're very, very used to these kinds of questions that go, oh my God, you know, we're messing up the environment, how do we protect it? But this separates us from our environment a little bit. The environment is something that's a little bit different and outside of us, rather than something that we are actually physically a part of. You know, and we'll talk a lot about environmental policy. We'll talk about, you know, the kinds of, you know, decision making that people make as individuals around environmental choices or not. But we never, you know, but our political systems, the structures, the institutions, the ideas that go into them, we imagine them very much as kind of separate to our environments. So asking a question like, I don't know, you know, to what extent has the environment shaped the political institutions that we have? That's a bit weird from a political perspective. But I'm asking it anyway, and I don't think it is weird. I actually feel that actually these things are inextricably entangled. It's just about how much we allow those entanglements to be visible. So some key concepts that we need in order to be able to sort of navigate these questions. So the first one is around, am I standing in front of the slides? You can, that's fine. So I'm starting, so the foundational one is about ecological entanglements. So this comes to us through people like Karen Barrard, who Matt introduced me to actually, who do sort of very complex kind of like physicist kind of questions that that I do not understand. However, but the idea behind them is about the way that things change things, or things change things. I'm not explaining it very well, so I'm just going to move on to that a little bit. Anyway, the by entanglement, what I'm talking about is about co-evolutionary processes. I'm talking about changes that happen that can't be reversed, but very probably couldn't be predicted either, but that end up being a thing. And so in this regard, I'm talking about the kind of conversations, co-evolutionary dynamics between the ecologies, between ecologies, between geologies, geographies, and the communities that end up developing around those ecologies, geologies, and geographies. What kind of, at a very, very basic level, we're talking about in this talk about Grass Valley in California. At a very, very basic level, what kind of people ended up populating this particular ecology and geology? What kinds of norms and backgrounds did they bring? What kind of practices did they do in order to survive? And how did they end up developing political institutions from that? And then how did those all end up developing? Hopefully this will be a little bit clearer later on. We're also talking about porosity. Okay, I'm going to start this. You know that song that goes like, "We are Stardust," and everything? And I want you to hang on for that thought, because essentially, right, we kind of are stardust. We're, all of the matter in our, all of the matter that makes up us, that makes up the things that are around us, etc., has all been in the universe ever since, when it was first initiated, and it reorganizes in different ways. The matter that makes up me, I find this a little bit mind-blowing, but the matter that makes up me has made up lots of different organisms before and things before it became part of this body that you see in front of you, which I find completely mind-blowing. So that's at the kind of like molecular level. But again, if we stick with bodies, I mean, I experience and imagine my skin as being like a solid boundary between my inside and my outside, right? But actually, my skin is porous. The clue is in pores, which we also know that we have, especially when we're teenagers. Our skin is porous. It lets in moisture. It lets in matter. And that sort of folds it into our bodies, or excretes stuff from our bodies as well. So it's not actually But if we start to imagine the world a little bit more in this way, then we start to see that actually everything is porous in some way or another. Everything is taking on other things, and objects that we see as real and solid in front of us now are not always going to be, and they haven't always been. It's all a process of fluidity of matter becoming things and other things. And the same kind of works with regards to ideas as well. I want you to think a little bit about the way that the matter that we encounter shapes how we end up thinking about stuff. So at a very basic level, how living in a particular place shapes the ideas that we end up holding about the world. The practical stuff about living in a particular place. If we imagine Gold Rush, California, just as an example, the practical skills that were required in order to be able to navigate that very crazy anarchic kind of environment, the practical skills that are required in order to be able to physically survive and feed yourself, all folds into a particular type of way of knowing about the world. Or in other words, a particular kind of way that we as individuals, but also as cultures, end up making our worlds. And it's through this, so it's not just the matter that from the environment that's kind of like porously, entangling itself with us as humans, but it's also the ideas within those spaces that end up creating publics and counter publics, and end up impacting on how we shape our places as well. The kinds of places that we build, the kind of human infrastructures or human facilities that we end up putting onto where that we end up putting, sort of physically building on the ecologies and geologies and geographies that we are talking about. Space for an entangled politics. I kind of talked about this a little bit just now, actually, so I'm just going to sketch over this. But it's the idea that our entangled communities, or our communities that are entangled with the physical and natural ecologies and geologies that they're a part of, it's kind of like an organism. It's kind of like a self-perpetuating, evolving organism that we're in it. In a lot of my work, I end up calling these assemblages, just because that becomes a really useful tool for me to be able to think about the different elements within that ecological entanglement of our communities and our environments. And for politics, there are lots of different spaces that this kind of arise, whether it's about the different kinds of the different types of publics that arise from different types of world making, whether we think about how that folds into political activism, how that folds into political economies, actually, whether it's like economies of our locality, but also economies, as we're going to see a little bit later on, global economies as well. And then the effective impact, the impacts that goes on to have on the environments within which we're situated. There's loads of different things to pull out here, so it's all quite interesting. Okay, so anybody here? So the case study that we're going to be looking at is a place called Grass Valley, which is in Nevada County in California. Anybody here not heard about the gold rush? If I talk about a 49er, anybody not know what I'm on about? Interesting. Okay, all right. Fun fact. In order to win California, in order for California to become part of the United States, initially it was part of Mexico. There was a long war. It was called the the American-Mexican War, something like that. And that America won that war in 1848. Very, very fortuitously, hugely fortuitously, in January of 1849, I think it was John Sutter, something like that, who was in this particular part of California, in what is now Nevada County in California. They found a guy called John Sutter found gold, and then everybody went totally nuts, as you can completely imagine, and gold fever arose from the fact that gold happening in gold being in California, this mineral thing, this piece of like metal matter that is from the ground, literally infected people, and that infection was so severe that it drew people from all the way around the world, not just in America. Oh my God! Yeah, anybody know about the wagon train in America? Right, this is where people would make months-long, deeply dangerous. I cannot describe how incredibly dangerous these journeys were. Enormous journeys from the East Coast of the United States across to the West Coast. This was dangerous in so many ways. Not only the practicalities of literally surviving, the other people on your wagon train, of the weather. There's a whole, I don't know, we can talk about that. Anyway, this is a slight digression. But the point is, enormous journeys by land, but also enormous journeys by sea. So another fun fact, in 1 week, I mean, obviously, you know, Cornwall, proud mining heritage, isn't it? And very definitely in the middle part of the 1800s as well. There was also, you know, there's been a strong, I'm sure a lot of you maybe will know the saying that, you know, wherever you go around the world, you're sure to find whatever hole you found around the world, you're sure to find a Cornish person in or Cornish man in, you know, because Cornish mining expertise was really at the forefront of global mining expertise. And so a lot of Cornish people also wanted to make that journey. They were also infected. Wow, how random is that? They were also infected by this metal. So in 1 week of 1849, more people emigrated from Cornwall than in the entire of the previous year. This was how bad gold fever was. This was how contagious it was. But this gold fever, it was all about, you know, it was a very ideational kind of entanglement, right? A very ideational kind of infection. It was about the kinds of meanings that in the European-based cultures placed on this shiny, malleable yellow matter, because the indigenous Indian communities, they knew about the gold. They just totally did not have a use for it. Apparently, they used to use it in slingshots, you know, because like you could turn it into things that you could throw at people. Quite hard. But that was the only use that they had for it. There was no meaning attached to this metal that that infected the local Indian tribes, and you know, etc., etc. Anyway, however, the impact of the gold infection on the local Indian tribes was absolutely immense. And in 10 years, 90% of indigenous peoples were killed or enslaved. Killed either physically, bodily. The first governor of California had put a bounty on Indian body parts, and or killed by European diseases, etc., etc. And Indians are also enslaved, and this is the same. At this point, I just want to kind of like mention the Nisenan community. If you Google them, they've got fantastic. Oh yeah, I can let you know the details a little bit later on. But they're trying to get federal recognition of their tribe, and it's not as easy as you might imagine that it should be. But so the Nisenan community are the local indigenous community in Ross Valley. But anyway, so this was about the power of gold that moved people, that moved populations, and also ended up creating European-based communities. Remembering, of course, there was already a very definite, very thriving human population in the area, but creating the town that we know of as Grass Valley. And which is just one part of a massive web of gold mining operations in California. So this gold was, the gold infection, it was physical and it was emotional, and it was transformational. It made this geological matter completely transformed the fate of that locality, also transformed the fate of the localities that people moved from, thinking of Cornwall, thinking about the trauma of losing members of your community who you might never ever see again, and creating physical communities out of these entanglements as well. And they also, these entanglements also go on to end up shaping the human built environments and cultural world makings that exist at that point in time. So I want you to imagine for a moment what kind of person can exist, can survive in that kind of frontier environment. Any thoughts?
Miners.
Huh?
Miners.
Miners, yeah, but not everybody, but Actually, another interesting fun fact, some people just really did not make it as miners because, like, you know, it was not a guarantee that you're going to make a fortune because as many people really didn't, or probably more people really didn't make it as made it. Some people found that actually, rather than mining, they became farmers instead, and they fed the miners, and that was a better way of. Then that's something else. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, like, physically able.
Very physically able. Actually, can we expand on physically able?
Strong.
Male, strong, aggressive. Yeah, absolutely.
Risk taking.
It's
not really physical, but I was going to say risk taking, not risk averse.
Yeah, you're right. Right. See, you know, kind of characteristics that in contemporary America right now, we might actually associate with a very particular political group that we might, as liberal academics, we might find challenging. But you know, you would have to be incredibly able at physically surviving in the environment and outside of the environment. You know, able to deal with whatever kind of sort of chances and stuff that you come across, which is also really interesting. I'm going to tell you a little story. So Grass Valley is really close to Grass Valley's neighboring city is called Nevada City, and Nevada City was mostly founded by American settlers, so people who had made the wagon train journeys, you know, who were physically very strong, physically very, you know, able. You had to be tough to be able to survive the wagon train. Grass Valley was mostly populated by Cornish miners, and I believe I'm right in saying that at the turn of the sort of the late part of the 1800s, the 60% of Grass Valley's population were of Cornish descent. If they hadn't arrived recently, they were of, you know, longer term sort of Cornish heritage. My understanding is that Nevada City had a much, or sorry, that Grass Valley had a much more conservative type of politics than Nevada City, literally 2 or 3 miles away. And the reason for that is that if you have if you left or made that transatlantic journey with all of your support systems, everything that you knew, you may well have been good at taking risks. However, when you found a spot, you didn't want those, you know, you wanted to minimize those risks, you know, and so that, my understanding, according to Gage McKinney, who's a historian in Grass Valley, that created a conservatism amongst Grass Valley, whereas Nevada City tended to be much more sort of liberal and progressive because they were American migrants mostly that had founded the city, and they didn't have quite that same sense of intense precariety that people did in Grass Valley, which is kind of interesting. But even down to the naming of places, so right the way along the gold rush, you know, the prime gold rush area in California, places are named after people who had found, you know, or you know, found or founded mines or mining areas. You know, the way that places are named very much reflects the geologies and the impact of the geologies on the human communities. Grass Valley isn't actually in a valley. However, if you'd on the wagon train, you just crossed over the crazy Sierra Nevada, the huge journey across the Sierra Nevadas, which was absolutely enormous and extremely dangerous, and many people died crossing them. You just cross over the Sierra Nevadas, and you just land in the foothills, and you discover this grassy plain, so your oxen can finally feed because they've been starving and really thirsty, and you know, all of these things. This land just looks like this heaven, and you call it Grass Valley, which echoes this sense of heaven that you feel about this ecology that after the ordeal that you've just been through. So we've got all of these ways that the geologies and the ecologies are shaping communities, and I just want to sort of talk a little, and again, thinking about the infrastructure within this particular community. So if you can see here, so this is the area where one of the biggest mines was, the Empire State Mine. And a lot of housing in this area was built specifically for mining, for miners and mining communities. So this gold infection was shaping the built environment because the housing was being built near the mine. If you can see Mill Street along here, can anybody tell me what the significance of a mill might have been? No.
Power.
Sorry?
Power.
Power.
Energy.
A massive power source. Yes, food and grinding corn is a thing, but the major reason for the mill on Mill Street would have been stamping or crushing tin ore, gold ore, quartz, in order crushing quartz in order to be able to extract the gold that was within it. And of course, milling wood or sawing wood, which also would would have been necessary for building houses and things like that too. Can't see the name, but there's another road up here that's also named after a mine, that was kind of like at the end of the road or along the road. So again, you're sort of getting the sense about how the physical infrastructure of even the current day town was initiated by by gold. There was something else I was going to add there as well. But oh yeah, and this road is called Church Street because that is the street that the various different churches were built in order for the miners to be able to worship and all of these kind of things. So yeah, so even now the physical place is impacted by its origins. Oh yeah, something else. Let's go back to here a minute. Something else. Gold wasn't just a nice to have. This shiny yellow metal the European-based societies have historically put such an enormous power into and an enormous value or sense of meaning into. Arguably, again, this is according to local historian Gage McKinney, who's written about these things, arguably helped the North helped the Union to win the American Civil War, because helped to fund the North's campaign, which sort of shaped national American politics. But what it also did is having that money supply, having that ready supply of resources that was controlled by largely, not exclusively, but largely American investors, meant that America had the capital in order to invest in its industrial revolution, which then enabled it to become the industrial powerhouse that it did, which then enabled America to become the global industrial powerhouse that it did, which then enabled America to become the global hegemon that it did. I mean, clearly, we only have to look at places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo to know that it is not enough to be resource rich in order to be globally powerful. So clearly, there have been other historical factors going on. However, we can make this argument that this piece of geological matter, or that finding this geological matter has impacted or shaped politics, not just at a local level, not just about town planning, but it's also shaped American politics and global politics as well. I find that kind of mind-blowing as well too. However, as you know, mines are not sustainable, are they, in any way, shape, or form? They come and they go. Oh yeah, that was the other thing that I meant to mention. Just a little bit about the kind of the importance of the local geologies. Mining used up an awful lot of trees. There was a lot of trees in this part of California. They cut them all down because they needed them to stoke their engines and all of that, do all of the various different things that they did. So they cut them all down, and then they're like, oh, damn. And then so the mines were closed down for a little while, and then the trees grew back. But also then they ended up developing other kinds of technologies, things like hydraulic mining using water in the area. So again, this is about the resources that were available in the locality that enabled them to better extract or more efficiently extract gold from the depths of the earth, etc. Which quite literally, the mining with water or hydraulic mining quite literally washed away mountains or moved mountains. Gold literally had the power to move mountains. Anyway, however, for all kinds of complicated reasons that we're not going to go into right now, gold mining stopped or largely finished around the 1950s. And so, you've got this post-war, post-industrial landscape. Okay. Oh, I should also say, Nevada County is about a 3-hour drive from San Francisco. This also really matters. Well, actually, it really mattered from a geographical perspective. When you're shipping your gold ore out, it is really, really handy that they were able to ship the gold ore out along the Sacramento River that took them to San Francisco and all of its massive port, connection to global markets, all good. So that's the geographical reason why it all worked. But so you are not too far from San Francisco. What is San Francisco known for? Anybody?
Seems very expensive.
Okay, I'm
Waste technology.
technology. I'm being I'm thinking about Richard Florida here, which isn't going to mean quite so much for people who haven't worked in regional development. But basically, it's known for really creative people, which is how come we've got this. Oh, nice one, cheers, Jane. So yeah, I think
Hippies, I was saying hippies.
it works too. Okay, so you've got a lot of very creative people in San Francisco for all kind of complicated reasons. And for all kind of complicated reasons, a lot of them want to spill out of the city, and they end up finding post-industrial regions. This is also familiar as well in many different ways all around the world. But they end up finding post-industrial regions to be really interesting. There's a lot of old mining machinery that's kind of like fun to play with and fun to make stuff out of, and a lot of kind of like interesting cultural things to kind of explore as well. But also, and this is a massive thing in San Francisco, also a lot of community making to do too. So you had a lot of people who became really influential and really important in the Nevada County area, or Grass Valley and Nevada City in particular, that moved to the former gold mining places and were building communities, starting community radio stations, getting involved in community activism and helping to make this poor place into something where people could flourish. You also got some tech companies. So then, and this is also feels very familiar to many different rural areas. So then you end up with companies that are a little bit more geographically mobile, going, do you know what, it'd be quite nice to relocate to somewhere where our staff can have a great quality of life. So then you end up with some tech companies moving into the area because, because their employees can have a great quality of life. Which then ends up contributing to something that you see around the world, not just in many different places. And my academic friend Rhiannon's going to be talking about ecological gentrification next week, next Thursday here. But she's talking about somewhere very different in the US. But it contributes to what we might describe as a kind of ecological gentrification, where landscape stops being about what we can produce or what we can dig out, and what we can sort of make with, how we can live practically on that landscape. Remembering, of course, that like everything that we use has either been mined or grown, so everything has come from a natural environment. And instead, the landscape starts to become recast for its amenity value. And the kinds of leisure activities that can be experienced within that space. So what we're starting to see here is quite a bit of a cultural shift, right? Of different kinds of peoples with very different kinds of world makings, very different types of meaning makings, coexisting, within a space and finding a way forward together, which ends up having a huge impact on political values. So something else, another fun fact. So Nevada County is also the home. Okay, anybody? Politics people, you probably have definitely heard about this, but maybe non-politics people, maybe not. Do you remember before we had Trump in America, we had the Tea Party? Anybody remember them? Got some very definite yeses, some few more physical. Anyway, so again, we're talking about an alt-right kind of extreme libertarian type of political movement, and that started out in Nevada County. Or at least people from Nevada County, I know, isn't it? But there's a little bit of a story about here as well, which becomes quite interesting. So, so you've got very, very libertarian people who want to be able to. By libertarian, we're talking about people who just want to, live their life back to the land, doing their thing without having governments coming in interfering with them. They just want to be able to do their thing without anybody kind of bothering them. But you've also got people from the Bay Area who are much more liberal. In the UK, we'd call it left wing, and some, those kind of different world making. So politically, it's a bit more complicated than it's narrated, as these pictures will show. But politically, there's a story that you hear quite a lot within Grass Valley around how it's a purple county, how it's really attractive to people wanting to move from the Bay Area to the countryside, because, and I also have to say the Bay Area is super expensive. It's, so there's a massive push value, as in, with many global cities, it's, even if you're earning a great wage, you're probably still sharing a house with like 6 other people, and it's put up. So there's a massive push value there. But so people are wanting to leave the Bay Area for other parts of California. But something that makes Nevada County really interesting is because it's considered as a purple state or purple county. And the story goes, unlike anywhere else in the area, which is a little bit more complicated than the story goes, it's kind of a bit of a swing county that a lot of people vote Republican, but also a lot of people vote Democrat. And literally only a few votes could sway it either way. So that becomes very attractive to people who want to live around other people with very similar kind of liberal world makings as themselves. And in especially post-COVID or during and post-COVID, there's been an enormous, a very large amount of migration or inward migration to the area, which of course has put a huge pressure on local housing markets and made it very, very difficult for local people to be able to stay. So all of those kind of complicated questions that arise around ecological gentrification, that arise around rural places becoming recast as amenity spaces, which then makes it harder, harder for local people to be able to have the kinds of jobs that actually help to pay for the inflated cost of housing. And at a kind of like a micro politics local level, or about the kind of things that matter in localities. Okay, what's the major global warming issue that California is facing? Anybody?
Drought.
Drought, absolutely. Right, so drought, and another word beginning with F. Fires, absolutely. Major issue with fires. And according to people in local government I've spoken to, it is only a matter of luck that Nevada County has not had a major fire yet. And so the county or issue, so what people want is, what the local government wants is for people who are living in the mountains at the end of a long, couple of miles of drive that is not up to the standard required in order to allow a fire truck to get up there. So these are really very, very vulnerable habitations. What the government really wants them to be able to do is either to pay additional taxes so that the roads can be brought up to standard, or to bring those roads up to standard themselves. But also what the government want them to be able to do is they want them to cut the fire break around their around the houses. So they want a kind of like a certain level of kind of cut where the trees get cut down, just to create a fire break. However, what you find is you've got people on their 5-acre mountain lots, where at the moment they can pretend that they are the only person on the mountain, but if they cut a fire break around their houses, then they can see their neighbours, and that kind of destroys the illusion. So they don't want to do it, because this is my right to do what I want on my land. It's complicated world makings that are deeply entangled with the environments, with the histories, with the stories of the place, but which also end up going on to shape what is possible and what is able to be done in this place. So we've got all kinds of interesting new sites of contestation, new kinds of displacements, older communities versus new communities, older, different kinds of world makings. I was going to say older world makings and newer world makings, but that is much more complicated than that kind of binary, and will take an awful lot longer than we've got to talk about. For some people are attracted to the area because of their desire to connect with local ecologies and geologies, and other people are attracted to the area, for other kinds of reasons as well. Legacy economies are no longer looked on favourably. Last year, the Environmental Protection Agency, last year, a company that is trying to reopen one of the gold mines had the environmental permit refused, and they had it refused because a lot of people campaigned really heavily against it. But then that also raises other things. So if we no longer want to mine stuff, I mean, maybe mining gold is a bit like, it's not really necessary, is it? Maybe it is, but in my head it's not. But this raises another set of questions around these kind of like these geopolitics of space, or entangled more than human politics of place, around where we mine stuff. Do we protect our own local environments that are so rich in amenity value and beautiful and everything, but do we still buy things that that are being mined in invisible places in other more vulnerable parts of the world, that don't have the power to be able to protect their ecologies and their geologies in the way that we do? Is my protection of my local ecology and geology, is that also is that also sitting with my desire to protect my global ecology and geology? I don't know, it's complicated. It feels like a lot to pull out there. Anyway, I've kind of gone on a lot, so I probably should start to wrap up. But basically, bottom line, it feels to me, I don't know about how to you all, but it feels to me really, really interesting to sort of exploring some of these threads about how actually our environments, our geologies and ecologies and geographies are shaping our politics, and looking at how they are doing that, the spaces and those kind of things, not just at a local level, but also this goes into a global level as well. Cheers.
Time for questions.
Okay. So like gold having like the power to shape local and global politics. Ages ago, I read a book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs and Steel. I don't know if anyone else has read it, but his argument, it's an old book, is really scaling that up to the idea of inequality across the globe being due to the orientation of continents, being due to mountains and other natural restrictions in transport and sharing of goods and ideas. And so this idea of like the Fertile Crescent and this stretch of Europe and Asia being more conducive to, if you want to call it progress, like the sharing, accumulation of wealth and power over neighbours, compared to Africa and North and South America. I was wondering if you kind of come across that argument and what you thought about that sort of scaling up of it.
Yeah, I've not actually read Jared Diamond's book. It is on my list.
Okay.
But I haven't actually looked at it properly yet myself. But also Ed Conway wrote a book that came out this year and it was serialised in Radio 4, so that was really helpful. Called Material World, and he's sort of doing this. He's not talking about the orientation of communities, but he is continents. But he's talking about kind of material objects, and it's not. Minerals. So he talks about lithium, oil, copper, and various other elements, and thinks about the way that they have shaped global political history. But yeah, so I think it's really, I think it's absolutely fascinating, really fascinating. But I'm still curious that people are not coming at this from a politics perspective. And I think that's something that politics academics might like to address.
Thank you. There's another one called Seeds of Change, which is like cotton and how that's shaped.
Yes, I can quite imagine.
Thanks for the talk, Joanie. I wanted to ask about partly your perspective from politics, saying other disciplines are already thinking this way in politics. And I'm thinking about someone like Bruno Latour, who would talk about objects and other organisms, anything more than human, as having agency and therefore being a political actor. And is the challenge for politics that it can only conceive of, from a disciplinary perspective, it only conceives of humans as political actors, or is it something different?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge that back in 2010, Jane Bennett kind of threw open to the politics sort of sphere, political analysts. And people have kind of like sketched around it. I mean, Jane Bennett is hugely cited, Vibrant Matter. It has been an extremely influential book, but and we do talk about questions around does the environment have rights and things like that, and there, you know, you do end up kind of bumping into questions around kind of like political agency, the agency of things, the political agency of things, but it's very much peripheral. And it's almost as if there's a couple of other politics people in here, I'd be really interested if you've got a different perspective as well. But from what, oh, and up here as well, yeah, big time, yeah. People who are joining us online, please chip in if you think that I'm wrong on here, but it feels as if it's much more comfortable for us to talk about these kind of political agency of things kinds of questions from a rights-based perspective, and you know, that kind of architecture that goes alongside sort of liberal democracy, than it does to kind of like step outside of that at the moment. But there are also people who are doing it, so maybe it's just about kind of gaining traction. I don't know if it. I also need, yeah, Rita's already said on the chat, if anybody has got any comments or wants to come in and ask questions that is joining us online, please do. Yeah.
We do have questions. There. Okay, other readings.
So Claire's saying, Tim Marshall, The Power of Geography, 10 maps that reveal the future of the world. But thinking about how geographies affect IR, and Winifred Gallagher. Claire, do you want to say something about them?
I don't especially want to say much, Joanie. I think you're absolutely right that people in politics don't write specifically about how people end up with particular voting preferences or how people end up running their everyday lives. But I just wanted to point out that there is that book on IR and there is a book on individuals. And I think that what you're looking at is kind of in the gap between those two things. But I think you'll still find them really interesting. That's all I want to say. Thanks for your talk, Joanie. Really good.
Cheers so much, Claire.
I just wanted to say as well, from an evolutionary theory perspective, actually, there are evolutionary outcomes that we can predict. So I was really interested in how you thought about the environment and communities or political systems as co-evolutionary, and still, I'm guessing it should be possible to actually test whether the outcome in terms of political direction or trajectory is predictable across societies and communities or places historically. I don't know if anybody has done that.
Yeah, I mean that would be interesting, wouldn't it? And especially sort of thinking about a number of different kind of diaspora communities, settler colonial communities, you know, and a number of different kind of like colonial communities, and kind of like how those end up shaping and developing, what the differences are, you know, but also what the similarities are, and the kind of predictability is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's, I don't know, from a social scientist perspective, I tend to think of it more in terms of tendencies, and it's like, okay, there may well be these tendencies that might push us in that way. They might absolutely not, because something kind of left field might come at it, or maybe the sort of the amplification of some things in this particular set of circumstances amplifies this like crazy here, but it just doesn't do it over there. And trying to understand what the complex world makings and entanglements are that are challenging that. But I don't know enough about evolutionary theory from your perspective, so I don't know. Are there some systems that is just kind of, it's so complicated that you can't predict them?
I guess so, but I mean, sorry, I didn't want to. Jane, you wanted to say something?
I'm thinking about your question, because in a way the talk pointed to the interruption of evolutionary culture, because you had your indigenous people who you would have said they were in some kind of dynamic symbiotic relationship with their environment, and they would have been acutely in tune with everything that's happening in it, and that was a kind of organic evolutionary culture. And then what's happened increasingly around the world is that human beings have got such power that they don't have to rely on their immediate environment to live, because they're importing. We've got global markets, we're importing so much stuff, and we have this potential to interrupt culture. That's what your gentrifiers are doing too. They're bringing a different culture into a place, so it's a kind of although you're talking about porosity, it's also very unporous in a way. It's like a layer in the geology, a break between one culture and another culture. And it might be nice to explore what that means, because it's a symbol of the fact that the Anthropocene has arrived, that human beings are so powerful, they can sit outside their environment, even if they have to exploit an environment somewhere else, like they might import lots of food from another country miles and miles away. So there's this kind of evolution, but also an interruption that we probably don't talk enough about.
That's a really, really interesting perspective. That's a really interesting perspective. I hadn't actually thought about it in terms of interruptions, but you bang on it. But and I think this is one of the reasons why right now I'm spending a lot more time than maybe I would like to, reflecting on the post-industrialism in the rural, because it literally is the first time in human history where we don't have to, as you said, where we don't have to be reliant on the resources in our localities. We can be entirely serviced from very, very far-flung places, and that's where issues of visibility really arises massively for me as well. It's not just what are we doing in our immediate locality, but it's also what does that invisibility of stuff that is happening a long way away help to perpetuate.
Part of the ecological entanglement.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Hi, Joanie. Yeah, thank you. I guess I have a question based on some of the other questions being asked, boundaries and stuff. So, like, I think there's really a space within a lot of this engagement with Indigenous authors as well, right, from the subject, particularly like thinking about where the case study is taking place and stuff. So, I don't know, it just makes me think of some of that stuff as well. Right? I think she's an Indigenous academic, and we went to a talk about reading tour. I think it's then like they wrote this really interesting book saying so excited because yeah, going to see this like huge academic talk, but then being super disappointed because we talked about these ideas of return and what it means. Yeah, I guess a lot more new ideas becoming more relevant and saying, well, that's just second nature to a lot like Indigenous thinkers. Yeah, there's so much great, I think, Indigenous authors and Indigenous stuff in this, right? Some super interesting stuff that I guess, politics is in ecology and Islam, so it's just more station. This thing is a really good space.
Yeah, and from so we've been like having all kinds of conversations with Shelley Covert, who's the spokesperson for the Nisenan community. That if you Google Nisenan and Chirp, CHIRP, something or another, California Heritage Indigenous Research Project, that'll take you to their website, and they've got some great videos as well, just that talks about stuff that they've been doing. But so it's interesting, isn't it? So you have Indigenous communities who are much more able to live in tune with their worlds. But then I was thinking about a conversation with Shelley where she also gets really frustrated by like having to play Indian to all of our like Western fuck ups, excuse me. But so it's about finding ways of having conversations that happen respectfully and in ways that can but that also we're being an ally with the communities that we're working with, and asking questions that actually help them. I know that Shelley gets really frustrated by the kind of like extractive nature of academic research. So it's about finding a way of not doing that, and finding a way of having those conversations around how Indigenous communities have done what they have done, and their relationships, you know, with the environment and what we can learn from that, but that also feeds into the questions that they're wanting to ask at a particular point in time too. But I think there is some really important learning that we can make if we just do it respectfully.
So it's already 2, so we should wrap up. There is one question online, but I just wanted to give the opportunity for anyone to leave who needs to rush off. And I don't know, Joanie, if you have the time to take that question.
Yeah, political ideologies and institutions play in shaping environmental policies and people's environment. Amina, do you want to ask it? I don't know if you're still online, Amina, but if you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Sorry. So yeah, thanks a lot, Joanie, for your talk. That was quite inspiring, actually. And I'm sorry, my camera is not working. I'm not sure what's going on. So that relates a lot to my research because I am quite interested in people, place, interaction, people, environmental interaction, basically, considering different political and social situation and different particularities depending on the place. So I'm quite curious to know from the context of your research and speaking about the gold rush and speaking about the environmental situation in America, California. So looking at the ongoing political polarization in America, so what do you think the political ideologies and institutions play in shaping the environmental policies and environmental culture perception of the environmental situation in the US, considering that political polarization?
Yeah, do you know what? This is absolutely an enormous question, and I feel like there are so many really rich threads to pull out of that. I'm also really aware that the Rhiannon Liebrich is with us online as well, and I'm sure that Rhiannon's got stuff to say about, you know, so Rhiannon is from the US, and yeah. I'm really aware that my own perspectives are very much kind of like as an observer, but I kind of there's all kinds of like little like shifts and intersections. So I kind of I'm wondering a lot around the levels to which, the kinds of qualities and world makings and abilities that underpinned like the frontiersmen and not just the gold rush frontiersmen, but the American frontiersmen. I'm wondering whether, which clearly doesn't have a place in it clearly struggles to have a place in contemporary America, especially contemporary urban America, right? But we also see being played out in the whole gun toting, Trump voting, rural, religious evangelical kind of political, amplificatory system. And before that, the Tea Party kinds of things. And I kind of wonder about the way that America is or isn't able to integrate these different environmental, these different world makings that have arisen from particular historical interactions with local environments. I feel that there is a lot in there to pull out. we can have a good old chat about it at some point if you like.
Thank you.
Super. I think we have to stop here, but can you all join me in thanking?
Thank you so much.